Yeah.
And she got me to go along to a church in Leeds, which was, I didn't know what the word meant then, but I now know it was an evangelical, Bible-believing, in other words, Bible-believing Church of England. And I went along there, and I heard different people say how they'd come to know Christ from all walks of life, soldiers, secretaries, managing directors, students, the lot. And it began to click in my dim mind that could all these people be wrong? Because they were very different people who'd come in different ways to Christ, yet they had one thing in common, that they had all said that they'd realized they were wrong and needed forgiveness and turned from that sin and asked Jesus into their life. And I remember well, one Sunday night, they had a Major General speaking at a guest service. Now, I avoided the army by 2 weeks. I just missed call-up because of my age. But when this fellow spoke, Major General Wilson Haffenden was his name. You don't forget those, do you?
You sure don't.
And I remember as he spoke, it seemed to me that here was a real man's man. He'd said he was a Buddhist when he was in the army, so he could get out of going to church on a Sunday. Now, that was my kind of man, you know. And yet he talked about how his marriage was a bit shaky and how he'd done wrong things that he was ashamed of, but that he'd seen again the same message, that Christ on the cross had taken the punishment for his sin and he'd asked him into his life. And that night I realized I needed Christ, but I did nothing about it.
Right.
My lifestyle was very much not picking up a Bible, my little pocket Bible, on a Saturday night, but it was picking up a pint or more than one pint after the rugby match. I was an avid rugby player and cricketer, and that was what it was. But coming to Leeds was a man called Tom Rees, who was an evangelist, and he was speaking on a Get Right with God campaign right round the country. And I went along, I have to say mainly because I had my eyes on a very attractive choir girl in the church, but also because my sister nagged me. So I went along, and that night when he spoke, I was terrible, I really was. I took with me the Yorkshire Evening News Green Final, so that when the message was on, it had been worn off, these feelings of needing Christ had worn off a bit by then. Yes. So when he was speaking, I took the Green Final out, and I used to play rugby union and support rugby league. And I was reading there how Leeds had got on against St Helens in the Rugby League Cup semi-final. To this day I regret that St Helens won. Yeah. But as I was reading it, it just seemed as if that fellow got me by the throat and said, "I'm talking to you." The place was packed, hundreds of people there. Yeah. But that night, as he spoke, I realized that I was the one who was wrong, that I was guilty, that I'd offended God and hurt others, and that I needed forgiveness. And that night, the cross of Christ that everybody spoke about seemed so real to me. It just seemed to me that he was dying for me and no one else. I know he was dying for anyone who will turn to him.
It was that real to you?
It was that real to me. And that night, in a prayer, I asked Christ into my life. That was in 1958.
What changes took place? Because, as you said, how old were you then?
I was about 18 then.
You know,
just started university.
Right. As you were saying, it was rugby, it was the pub, it was all these things that you were involved in.
Yeah.
Was there, and I know people often ask this, and was there instant change on some things and problems on others, or you got convicted and it took a while to work through? How did that change take place?
That's a very good question. You'd expect this answer from a lawyer, wouldn't you? The answer is yes and no. Yeah. On the other hand, we have more hands.
I had a lawyer on last week, and he took some of the questions on advisement. Yeah.
Well, they say lawyers have got more hands than an octopus. On the other hand, on the other hand, on the other hand. Yes. But it was yes and no. There were some immediate changes in my life. And I suppose early on, I felt I'd do anything for Christ. But then I realized it was more than emotion.
Yes.
And it was a willingness to turn my back on my way, the Frank Sinatra thing, I'll do it my way. And a willingness to ask Christ to take over. For example, some things cleared immediately: swearing, filthy language, the dirty jokes, things like that went. But in Leeds, it was then called the National Young Life Campaign, but they modernised. They're a super group. They're still on the go, and I'd recommend them to any young Christian, teens or early 20s or even 30s. And there I met Christians from all churches, Bible-believing Christians, who really went the extra mile for God. They were running open-air meetings outside the Leeds Corn Exchange on a Saturday night, which was, again, not a theological environment. I got a split lip and a black eye there from someone who didn't agree with me, but I'd done that in rugby, so why not for the gospel, you know? I didn't hit him back this time, that's the difference. But these people, they had prayer meetings. I never bothered with prayer meetings. And yet ordinary folks, one was a bricklayer, I remember, very badly educated, but praying from his heart that other people would come to know Christ. So the person who led it became one of the leading authorities on rheumatoid arthritis, Professor Werner Wright. And it was in his home, the prayer meetings on a Saturday night. And then they were linked with a group called United Beach Missions, which is still going strong, up to 1,000 young people each summer go to the various resorts all over the country, and in Belgium, Mission Vacances, and France, where I personally am involved now. And they are there to help folks to understand the gospel. Well, I came into contact with these people when I was about 18. And I just saw people there who meant what they said and said what they meant. And yet there was a great fun-loving aspect to it as well. And Young Life and United Beach Missions have done more for me than any other group, you know. And that helped me to go on.
Yeah, we can talk a bit more about them in a minute, but it seems to me, I mean, I came to Christ in '63, round about the same time. And, and as I talk to people from that era, and as I think about my own life, yes, there were the initial struggles and that you went through, and where some things happen immediately, others didn't.
Yes.
There seemed to be a willingness to commit themselves to it because of the gospel you heard, and because of the challenge of that gospel that you heard, i.e., Christ deserves everything.
Yes.
And he has given you everything, and that's what he wants.
It's like C.T. Studd's quote, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
The England
my favourite book.
Yeah, if Jesus Christ be God and died for me, then no sacrifice can be too great for me to make for him. And he gave up a fortune and his life on the mission field for that.
Yeah. But it seems to me that what we're seeing today, so often the gospel has been watered down.
Yes.
And it's almost as if, well, let's make it a little less so that more people come. But we're not seeing the same, I don't think, in the same way. You know, and you can't generalise, because there are some young people out there that are totally given over to the Lord, and we've got to acknowledge that. Yeah. But there seem to be so many that also are not. Yeah. Maybe because of the gospel they've heard. Is that something that you are seeing in your work?
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, I won't mention names here because I haven't got a hit list.
Right.
But there is one well-known church in America which has had fantastic growth, and has recently been honest enough to say that they've done things to make it user-friendly and get people in, but they are not making disciples.
Right.
I think it was great honesty and humility on their part to say that.
Yes.
And I feel that one of the problems is in our churches, that we cater for young people, our young people's fellowships and what have you, entertain them, make them feel at home, and which is right. They should be warmly welcome, but they don't put them to work.
Yeah.
I mean, with Weil and UBM, when I first, you know, when I came back to the Lord and linked up with them, I was expected, and I wanted indeed, to go down to the open-air meetings at the Corn Exchange on a Saturday night and outside Leeds Town Hall on a Tuesday lunchtime, and I was expected to go on the door-to-door visitation and to go around and see people to help them, you know, and I was taught also that the starting point of giving is the tithe, that you start with the 10th and then you give after that, that your money isn't your own. And you don't sit at home watching doubtful programs on the television. You have too much valuable stuff to do.
Yeah.
And I feel it's very hard for a lot of young people today, and although I'm a dinosaur, I love speaking at young people's house parties. One of the first bookings that came in after I retired as general director was a young people's house party up in the north, and I was thrilled to bits with that.
Right.
But I feel that we need to get back to this, to give people a fun time, give them a warm time, welcome them, talk to them, understand their problems, but we do need to help young people to work for the Lord.